The courtroom was packed, the air thick with judgment, whispers slithering through marble walls like snakes hungry for scandal. At the defense table sat a woman wrapped in a ragged gray shawl, her face hidden beneath matted hair, her eyes empty, like windows to a soul long abandoned. No one looked at her like she was human, just another case number, another failure of the city no one wanted to claim. The prosecutor's voice echoed like thunder, spitting words like theft, trespassing, public disturbance, as if she were a wild animal that needed caging. And yet, behind all that silence, the homeless woman's lips trembled. Not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. Memory. She had once known laughter that lit up halls, hands that held hers like treasure, and a name whispered not as pity but as pride. But that life was stripped away piece by piece, until all that remained was a body beneath bridges, surviving off half-eaten apples, and mercy too rare to count. As the judge glanced over her file with mild boredom, she knew how this would end. 6 months behind bars or another mental health facility she'd escaped from in 3 days. No one in the room knew who she had once been. No one cared to ask. That is, until the back door of the courtroom creaked open, and in stepped a man in a $1,000 suit, eyes stormy, jaw clenched. Not a lawyer, not a witness. A judge. Gasps fluttered across the courtroom like startled birds as the man walked straight to the bench, bypassing every rule, every tradition. "Your Honor," he said, his voice deep, weathered, unmistakable. "I request permission to speak, not as a judge, but as a man who owes this woman his life." The presiding judge blinked, taken aback, the gavel trembling slightly in her hand. The homeless woman slowly raised her head, eyes wide, lips parting in disbelief. She knew that voice. Somewhere deep in her shredded memory, that voice was a lighthouse in a storm she never thought would end. It was him. But how? Years ago, before the streets claimed her, she had stood on the other side of a different courtroom, not as a criminal, but as a rising star in a law firm she built from dust. He had been nothing then. A scared, stuttering intern wrongly accused of fraud, abandoned by his firm, betrayed by his friends. She had fought for him when no one else did, stayed late reviewing files, torn through lies until the truth stood tall. And because of her, he had walked free. "That woman," the judge said, now standing before the courtroom, voice trembling with fire, "once saved me. Today, I return that debt." Whispers erupted again, but this time they weren't cruel. They were confused, curious. The woman sat frozen, her eyes locked onto his face, trying to reconcile the powerful man before her with the young, broken boy she once defended. No one knew her story. No one had cared to ask why a woman with once polished hands now wore fingerless gloves and hid from sunlight. She had been buried under the labels people spat at her like venom, crazy, junkie, liar. And yet not once did anyone ask the simplest question: what happened to her? The courtroom stilled as the judge turned to the prosecution and said, "May I address the court directly?" The presiding judge hesitated, then gave a slow nod. The man walked closer to the defendant's table, his every step deliberate, each footfall carrying years of guilt. "She doesn't belong in chains," he began, voice low but firm. "She belongs in a courtroom, yes, but behind a bench, not in front of it. You see, 10 years ago, I was a terrified intern, framed for embezzlement, ready to give up everything. Everyone turned their backs on me, except her." Gasps again, murmurs. The woman still said nothing, just watched him as if scared that blinking would make him vanish. I didn't even know her then. I was nobody. But she took my case for free, stayed past midnight combing through documents no one wanted to touch. She proved my innocence, fought like a lioness, and she won. The courtroom leaned in now. The entire building held hostage by his words. And after that trial, I rose. I studied harder, worked longer. I told myself I'd one day be the kind of man who would fight like she did. And today, I find her here, a defendant, in shackles. I failed her. We all did. The last line landed like a hammer, breaking through indifference like glass. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes, but she quickly looked down, hiding her face in the collar of her coat. The prosecutor objected, mumbling something about relevance, but it was too late. The jury's hearts had already turned. The judge continued, his voice thick with emotion now. I did some digging when I saw her name. I learned she lost everything 3 years ago. Her husband died in a car crash caused by a drunk driver who was never charged. Her law firm was taken over in a hostile acquisition. Her home was repossessed after the insurance company denied her claim. The gallery was silent, and yet she committed no crimes. She didn't hurt anyone. Her only sin was surviving in a world that forgot her. The presiding judge blinked, visibly shaken, her eyes drifting toward the defendant now with something resembling shame. And this arrest? The man said, holding up a flimsy file. She was found asleep on a park bench, clutching a photo of her late husband. That's the crime. Loitering. A woman who once defended this city's most powerful is now treated like trash for resting her grief on a bench. The woman whimpered softly, as if the truth itself wounded her more than the years of cold. And it did, because what hurts more than cruelty is being forgotten by the very world you once protected. The gallery was no longer neutral. They looked at her now, not with fear or disgust, but with heartbreaking recognition. She wasn't a monster. She was someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone who had once stood tall in heels and a blazer, who now shrunk into herself, beneath layers of dirt and shame. When I became a judge, the man continued, I promised I would never forget what justice truly means. And today, justice means standing beside this woman, not above her. The gavel never dropped. The courtroom no longer functioned like one. It had become something more sacred, a reckoning, long overdue. The presiding judge finally spoke, her voice softer than before. You say she saved your life. What do you propose? The man looked down at the defendant, his eyes shimmering. Let me take responsibility for her. Let me ensure she gets shelter, care, and most of all, dignity. She deserves more than freedom. She deserves restoration. The woman's lips parted, and for the first time in years, she spoke. Why? She whispered, voice cracked and faint. Why would you do this for me? He knelt beside her, reached for her trembling hands, and said, Because you never asked that question when I needed you. Her tears flowed freely now, washing away the years like melting frost. The presiding judge looked at her again, not as a defendant, but as a victim of a broken system. Case dismissed, she declared, with prejudice. The words echoed louder than any gavel. The gallery stood in stunned silence as the bailiff removed her cuffs. For a moment, no one moved. Then she stood slowly, her knees shaking, supported, gently by the man who once trembled before her courage. They walked out of the courtroom, not as judge and defendant, but as two survivors rewriting an ending that the world never bothered to finish. Outside, the city air was thick with smog, but she breathed it like spring. Reporters swarmed, flashing cameras, shouting questions. But he raised a hand, shielding her with his body. No statements today, he said firmly. This woman doesn't need headlines. She needs healing. He guided her into a black car, waiting by the curb, not a limo, not a police cruiser. Just a simple vehicle with warm seats and quiet mercy. And as the door shut behind her, the woman closed her eyes and felt something unfamiliar surge through her chest. Safety. Not riches, not revenge, just safety. And for the first time in years, she smiled. Not wide, not bold, but enough to remind herself she was still capable of it. She had been broken, yes, but not erased. And the man beside her, the boy she had once saved, had grown into the kind of man she had believed still existed in the world. Her head leaned against the window, the city lights blurring like tears, and somewhere deep within her bones, she felt the warmth of something returning. Not just hope, not even justice, but humanity. As the car drove past alleys she once called home, the woman watched them not with fear, but clarity. Every corner, every cardboard mattress, every pair of eyes that once flinched from hers, they all told a story she now understood wasn't just hers. It belonged to all of them, the forgotten, the labeled, the discarded. Her suffering was not an isolated tragedy. It was a mirror, reflecting everything society refuses to see. And now, someone had looked into that mirror and not turned away. The judge beside her hadn't just saved her. He had remembered her humanity when the world stripped it away. Back in the courtroom, the silence lingered long after they were gone. Reporters muttered into phones. The prosecutor stood frozen, face pale, his arguments lying in tatters. The jury, once distant, now whispered to one another with guilt pressing down like bricks. Even the presiding judge sat motionless, tapping her pen not out of boredom, but deep thought. Because in that one moment of defiance, when a fellow judge had stood up not for law but for love, a crack formed in the machinery of indifference. And once something cracks, light always finds a way in. Something had changed, not just for the woman, for everyone who witnessed it. That evening, the story spread like fire, but not just as news. It became confession. One by one, people took to their feeds, their forums, their dinner tables, admitting what they'd ignored. I walk past the homeless every day. I never once thought to ask why they were there. I thought they were all addicts. I never imagined they could be someone like her. I judged without knowing. I see that now. The woman had not intended to start a movement, but sometimes the purest revolutions begin not with speeches, but with simple truth. Her face, once seen as shame, was now a challenge. Who else had they thrown away? The judge who stood for her received praise, yes, but he also received letters. Hundreds. From other judges, lawyers, students. I had forgotten why I entered law. You reminded me. I saw you speak. I want to do better. I used to think justice was about punishment. Now, I see it's about protection. His chambers became a shrine of remorse and awakening, not to glorify himself, but to honor what one act of memory could inspire. He didn't read those letters aloud. He showed them to her. And every time her eyes widened in disbelief, he smiled and said, "This is the power you always had. I'm just helping others see it." But the deepest awakening happened quietly, in the quiet minds of those who never spoke up before. A woman on a subway who now carried granola bars in her bag. A businessman who started looking people in the eyes again instead of looking away. A teenage girl who stopped scrolling and started volunteering. The homeless shelters reported a strange surge, not just of food and blankets, but of time. People were showing up, asking names, listening. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. Because they had seen her. And once you truly see someone, it becomes harder to pretend you didn't. For the woman, the awakening was slow and painful. Her body still flinched at loud noises. Her fingers still curled instinctively, when given anything warm, afraid it would be snatched away. But something inside her had begun to heal. Not just because she was safe, but because she was seen. She didn't need the world to fix everything overnight. She just needed to know the world could still care. She sat one morning by the window of her temporary shelter, watching the sunrise, and whispered to herself, "They know I exist." Not out of vanity, but out of victory. She had existed all along. Now finally, the world admitted it, and for the man beside her, the judge who had risen from her past, there was no turning back. He now carried not just robes and law books, but responsibility. Every time he entered a courtroom, he saw ghosts in the gallery, faces that no longer looked foreign. He changed the way he ruled. He changed the way he listened. He spoke less and heard more. And in every decision, he asked himself, what if this were her? What if this were me? Because morality, he had learned, isn't a paragraph in a textbook. It's a choice we make every time we decide whether to protect or abandon a stranger. This story, in the end, did not go viral because of a twist. It went viral because it was truth. And truth, when told with vulnerability, becomes a kind of medicine. It doesn't just soothe the wounded. It warns the powerful. It awakens the sleeping. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it redeems the guilty. That's what she had done simply by surviving, by standing up in a courtroom not to defend herself, but to let someone else defend what's right. And that's the deepest kind of courage there is. It happened on a quiet morning, just a week after the trial, when the woman finally asked to visit her husband's grave. She hadn't returned there since the funeral, too broken, too ashamed of the state she'd fallen into. Now, standing at the cemetery gate, dressed in second-hand clothes but with her head held a little higher, she hesitated. The judge gently placed a hand on her back, nodding without saying a word. She took a breath so deep it shook her ribs, then stepped forward, every inch of grass a battlefield between who she had been and who she was trying to be again. The gravestone hadn't changed, just her. Moss crept along the edges. The carved name still glistened in the sun, Daniel Reyes, beloved husband. She fell to her knees, not gracefully, but like a tree giving up after too many winters. And then the sobs came, ugly, loud, real. They cracked from her throat like a language the world had forgotten. "I'm sorry," she whispered, clutching the stone as if it were his hands. "I'm so sorry I couldn't hold on." The judge stood back, silent, watching pain that no court could cross-examine. This wasn't guilt. This was grief, raw and unfinished. "I wanted to die after you," she cried, her fingers trembling across the cold marble. "But the world wouldn't let me go. It just kept me breathing, kept me aching. And I got so tired, Daniel, so tired of hoping someone would see me." Her voice cracked again. "And then he did," she said, looking over her shoulder at the judge, who lowered his eyes, tears welling. "You always said kindness would come back to me, but I didn't believe it. I stopped believing everything." Her forehead pressed to the stone, and she whispered, "I forgot how to live without you, and I forgot how to let anyone help me." The judge walked forward slowly, kneeling beside her, hand barely touching her shoulder. "You saved me once," he said, voice thick, broken. "I was drowning in a lie no one believed I hadn't told. You fought like it was your own life on the line. And when I walked free, I promised myself I'd honor that gift. But I forgot that you needed saving too. I forgot to look back." His voice cracked now, low and trembling. "I wish I'd found you sooner." Her eyes met his, both red with tears, both haunted by the years lost. And in that moment, no titles mattered. Not judge, not defendant. Just two broken people trying to carry each other. She reached for his hand, not because she needed it to stand, but because in that moment, she wanted it. The difference meant everything. They stayed like that for minutes, saying nothing. Letting memory pass between them in silence, what she lost, what he owed, and what they could still become. The sun rose higher, cutting through clouds like grace. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, eyes still glassy, but her spine straighter. "I think," she said softly, "I'm ready to go home." The judge nodded. "Then let's build you one." She didn't know it yet, but he had already liquidated part of his private investments to secure her long-term care. Not a donation, not a favor, a promise. The money went not just to her housing, but to a foundation in her name, to help other displaced lawyers, social workers, and professionals whose lives had unraveled in silence. He didn't attach his own name to the initiative. In fact, he instructed the board to keep his involvement confidential. It wasn't about redemption for him. It was about restoring something the world had stolen, from her and from so many others like her. He returned to his chambers late each night, long after the press had moved on, quietly working through new legislation designed to soften sentencing for non-violent vagrancy offenses. He combed through cases, sending anonymous letters to judges in neighboring districts, urging them to re-examine files with human eyes, not just legal codes. No interviews, no speeches, just action. The kind that doesn't trend, but transforms. Every time someone asked if he was exhausted, he just smiled and said, not nearly as tired as she was all those years. It was the kind of tired that builds legacies, not in stone, but in people. One day, she found out, not from him, but from a young man in a shelter. "You're the reason I'm getting a second chance," he said. "There's a program with your name on it." Her heart stopped. When she asked him who funded it, he shrugged. "Some judge. Never said his name." Her hands trembled as she clutched the pamphlet, recognizing the exact way he had worded the mission statement. She'd once said those very words to him in court. Everyone deserves to be seen before they're sentenced. He had turned her philosophy into policy, not for recognition, but because it was right. Later that night, she knocked on his office door. He looked up, surprised but not startled. She didn't speak. She just stepped forward, holding the pamphlet in her hand, and placed it gently on his desk. Her eyes said everything. "I know what you did." He didn't deny it, didn't explain, just smiled softly and said, "You saved me before I ever wore these robes. I'm only repaying the debt." She sat beside him, and for a while, they said nothing. Just two souls who understood that the deepest acts of love don't come with headlines. They come with healing. The world kept turning. The press found new stories, but in one quiet corner of the city, lives were changing, silently, steadily, with no fanfare. And at the heart of it stood a man who gave without asking, and a woman who had once given everything. Their pain had not disappeared. Their pasts still whispered. But in the quiet ripple of their sacrifice, others had begun to swim instead of drown. And that, perhaps, was the greatest justice of all, the kind no courtroom could measure. The next chapter of her life began not with fireworks or fanfare, but with a locked door and a key she held in trembling hands. The judge had found the old two-bedroom unit himself, a quiet place on the outskirts of town, far from the memories that had once swallowed her whole. As she stepped in, her eyes scanned the bare walls and dusty windows, not with fear, but with purpose. She turned to look at him, his hand still resting on the doorknob like a father leaving a child at school for the first time. "It's yours," he said gently. "Not charity, not a favor. Yours." She didn't respond. She simply walked in, dropped her bag on the floor, and for the first time in years, closed the door behind her with the confidence that no one could take this from her again. But healing wasn't as neat as the key in her hand. There were days her fingers shook too much to hold a mug. Nights when every creak in the hallway pulled her straight back to cold pavement and distant shouting. He never pried, he never pushed, but he was always there, texting at sunrise, knocking, at dusk with takeout containers, bringing books she once said she loved but had long forgotten. Each visit, each silent gesture, was his way of standing between her and the storm she hadn't yet named. Not as a savior, as a guardian. Quiet, steady, unmovable. He would not let her fall again. Not this time. Not while he was still breathing. Word spread in legal circles that the judge had changed, that his rulings had grown softer, more precise, more human, that he now asked different questions from the bench. Where is this person going after? This? Instead of just, what did they do? Whispers buzzed in courthouse hallways. Some called it sentimentality. Others said it was weakness. But he didn't care. He'd seen what the system had done to her, what it had failed to see. He would not let another life slip through the cracks just to preserve appearances. His voice in court became firmer, sharper, but never cruel. Justice, he had learned, wasn't loud. It was resolute. It was protection in the face of blindness. At night, when she couldn't sleep, she began writing again. Her old notebooks now full of thoughts she used to whisper only to herself. Not memories, missions, stories of those still left behind. She wrote of shelters that turned people away, of police reports filed and ignored, of women like her, intelligent, educated, broken down by grief and crushed by poverty's merciless gears. And he read every word, not because he pitied her, but because he knew she held the very blueprint of what needed to change. He began sharing her stories in legislative briefings, quietly, without name or credit, but always with urgency. "This is real," he'd say. "Read it, and then try to forget it. I dare you." Then came the backlash. A wealthy donor tried to pressure him to reverse a compassionate sentence. A law firm threatened to file a complaint against his rulings. They whispered that he was compromised, that he'd become too emotional, too biased. "Judges don't fight for people," one board member sneered during a private hearing. He stood up, slow but certain, and said, "Then maybe more judges should." He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. And when the vote came, he stood alone on principle, refusing to betray the new standard he lived by. Not for money, not for reputation, not for fear. His resolve was no longer professional. It was personal. She was watching. The world was watching. And he would not bend. Back at her small apartment, she began collecting newspaper clippings and taping them to the wall. Not of herself, but of those whose lives had been changed because of the programs now blooming in her name. Veterans reunited with family, teen mothers reunited with hope, addicts who hadn't relapsed in over a year. She studied every face, like a sacred archive, whispering their names to herself as if anchoring them to memory. Because now she wasn't just surviving, she was rebuilding. And in every photograph, she saw the result of one man's stubborn belief that she was still worth fighting for. His strength became her spine, and hers in turn became his armor. One day, As she walked out of the community center she now volunteered at, a man from her past called her name. He was one of the lawyers who had once mocked her when she showed up to court disheveled, weeks before she disappeared. He looked older now, sadder. He stammered an apology, hands wringing. I didn't know what you were going through," he said. "If I had—" She raised a hand, not in anger, but to stop him from drowning in his own guilt. "You didn't look," she said. "That's worse." But then her voice softened. "You can now. There's still time." And with that, she turned and walked away. Not coldly, but with purpose. She had no room for resentment, only forward motion. The judge heard about the encounter the next day and felt the tension rise in his chest like a distant drum beat. He'd seen it before. How the past tries to worm its way back in. He showed up at her apartment without knocking. She opened the door with eyebrows raised, surprised. He didn't smile, didn't joke, just looked at her with those fierce eyes that once melted juries. "Are you okay?" he asked. No pretense, no small talk. She nodded. "I didn't need to be rescued," she said quietly. "But it feels good knowing someone's standing guard." And for the first time, she let her head fall on his shoulder, not out of weakness, but because she knew he could carry the weight. He started sleeping less, working longer, not because he had to, but because he wanted to be ready for anything that might come against her again. He studied old laws, looked for loopholes that had once buried people like her in paperwork and silence. He trained young clerks to read with empathy, to spot the signs that someone's case was more than what it looked like on paper. Every ruling he made now was a message. No more slipping through the cracks. He wasn't just protecting her story. He was protecting a generation who might never meet her, but would feel her resilience in the rules that no longer overlooked them. Then came the interview request, a national platform, prime time. The host wanted the woman and the judge to appear together to tell their inspirational story. She refused immediately. "I'm not a spectacle," she said. But the judge surprised her. He declined too, but with a twist. He asked the host if they would instead spotlight the shelter director, the community nurse, and 2 ex-convicts who'd turned their lives around thanks to the initiative. "We're not the story," he said. "They are." And though the host pushed back, hungry for ratings, the judge never wavered. He wasn't here for applause, he was here for results. Weeks passed. The program grew. She began mentoring women, coming out of similar darkness. Some looked at her with disbelief. How could someone like her understand what they'd been through? Until she took off her scarf, rolled up her sleeves, and told them the truth. Not polished, not prettified, just raw. And they listened. Because pain speaks pain's language, and strength, when offered with humility, is impossible to ignore. The judge watched from a distance, hands clasped behind his back, never interrupting, never claiming credit, just watching the fire he had once shielded from the storm now blazing on its own. The ultimate test came one evening when a letter arrived. Her name was on the envelope. Inside, a formal invitation to speak at the regional judicial conference, keynote speaker. She froze. The paper trembled in her hands. It was too much, too fast, too public. But then she remembered the courtroom, the stone. The moment the judge had stood up for her when no one else had. And she realized, this wasn't about her fear. It was about someone else's future. She called him. He answered on the first ring. "Do you think I'm ready?" she whispered. He didn't pause. "I know you are, but I'll be in the front row just in case you need to borrow my courage." The day of the conference, she stood behind the podium with eyes scanning a sea of black robes and gray suits. Every heartbeat echoed in her ears. But then she saw him, sitting exactly where he promised. Hands folded, eyes locked on hers, and she began to speak, at first quietly, then stronger. She spoke of failure, of being overlooked, of being labeled instead of listened to, and then of being seen. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the judge who once doubted her wiped away tears. And when she ended with, "All it takes to change a life is for one person to refuse to look away," the entire room stood. He never stood. He just sat there, eyes shimmering, chest full, hands shaking, because he didn't need to be seen. He needed her to be seen, fully, finally, fiercely. And that was all he had ever wanted. The judge sat alone in his chambers long after the courthouse lights had dimmed, turning an old file over in his hands, a case from 10 years ago. He recognized her handwriting on the margins, legal notes scrawled with such fire it pierced through the yellowed paper like a ghost. It was the last case she'd worked on before vanishing. He remembered brushing it aside back then, calling it too emotional to be objective. That memory now seared him. Back then, he hadn't just failed her. He had failed the client. A wrong that could have been righted, if only he'd listened. The guilt wasn't just personal, it was judicial, and it demanded redemption. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he found the woman whose case it had been. A grandmother wrongly accused of neglect, who'd lost custody of her grandchild. She lived alone now, arthritis stiff in her bones, but her eyes still burned with that quiet ache of injustice. When he told her who he was and what he'd come to do, she didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just said, "I always wondered what happened to that girl." She believed me. No one else did. He reopened the case, quietly, relentlessly, not for praise, for peace. Her story wasn't just an old file. It was a wound he had ignored, and now needed to heal. Meanwhile, the woman he once failed, his silent ally, the heart behind every reform he now pushed, was facing her own storm. She had been invited to speak at a donor gala, one she knew was funded by some of the very people who once stepped over her on the street. She almost didn't go. But then she remembered what he'd taught her. Silence, too, is a form of surrender. She arrived in simple clothes, no makeup, hair tied back, and took the stage with no fanfare. And when she told them she had once eaten from dumpsters outside their buildings, the room turned cold. "You stepped over me," she said. "But tonight, I'm stepping into the light you thought I'd never see again." The judge read about it in the paper the next morning, his breath catching at her words. There was power in her voice now, truth sharpened into steel. And yet, he saw something else in her eyes during a private moment later that week. "Do you ever wish it had been different?" she asked him, eyes not bitter but searching. He paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he did. "Every day," he said softly. "But if I hadn't failed you then, I wouldn't be standing beside you now." Her expression didn't change, but her shoulders softened, because that was the redemption she never asked for, but always deserved. And so they walked forward, scarred but not shattered, tethered not by the past they regretted, but by the future. They were rewriting together. He continued to fight in courtrooms, she in community halls. Every time they passed a person hunched on a sidewalk or heard a story of someone being discarded, they felt that same flicker in their chests. Not guilt anymore, but fuel. Fuel for letters, for laws, for love that shows up not with words, but with presence. They could not erase the past, but they could drown it in a sea of better choices. And in doing so, they proved that even the deepest regret can give birth to the brightest redemption. The courtroom was packed, not for a trial, but for a hearing that would decide the future of a law they had both fought to push through, one that would protect homeless individuals from being criminalized for sleeping in public spaces. Cameras lined the walls. The opposition was loud, well-funded, and dressed in polished suits with cold eyes. They argued statistics, painted fear, and called compassion a loophole. And though the judge couldn't preside over the vote, he sat in the crowd, hands clenched on his knees, unable to do anything but watch as she walked toward the podium, his once broken witness, now the voice of a movement. The silence that followed her name was deafening. She stood behind the microphone, trembling, but not from fear. Her breath was steady. Her fingers clutched a worn folder full of stories written by others who hadn't made it. "I'm not here to impress you," she began, her voice low. "I'm here to remind you what forgetting looks like." Then she told them about Ellie, the 17-year-old who froze behind a gas station dumpster because the shelter turned her away. About Marcus, a vet whose PTSD screamed louder than city noise and who spent his last night alive on a bench the law would now deem illegal. "This bill," she said, "is not about politics. It's about permission. The permission to exist." Councilman interrupted her. "Why should we listen to someone with your history?" he asked, voice dripping with condescension. A murmur rippled through the room. Her hands tightened, but her gaze never wavered. "Because I survived what you ignored," she replied. "And I'm not asking for your pity. I'm demanding your responsibility." A single clap echoed from the back. Then another. Slowly, more followed, until half the room was on their feet. But she didn't smile. She wasn't finished. She opened the folder and began reading letters. Real ones. From mothers, war survivors, children. Raw, handwritten truths that couldn't be debated or denied. The vote was close, too close. Hours passed as deliberations went on behind closed doors. She and the judge waited in the hallway, seated on the same bench she once sat on while waiting to be arraigned for trespassing. He didn't speak. He just offered her his coat when her arms began to shiver. And finally, the door opened. A woman from the committee stepped out, eyes rimmed red. "It passed," she said quietly, "by one vote." The judge closed his eyes. The woman exhaled slowly, as if breathing for the first time in years. That night, no celebration followed. Only a walk in silence beneath city lights, the two of them staring up at the sky like survivors of a war only they truly understood. But the real inspiration came weeks later when she returned to the same corner where she used to sleep. A young girl stood there now, backpack slung over her shoulders, eyes darting with fear. No shelter bed was available yet, but this time there was a legal outreach van parked just steps away. A volunteer waved her in. She looked at the woman and hesitated. "Are you someone important?" the girl asked softly. The woman crouched down and smiled. "No," she said. "I'm someone who knows what it's like to matter too late, and I won't let that happen to you." And in that moment, the girl stepped forward, not just into the van, but into a future rewritten by the bravery of someone who once had nothing but her story. Time passed, but some things refused to fade. The woman, once invisible to the world, now ran a quiet foundation that didn't boast or advertise. It simply showed up where no one else would. Under bridges, near bus stations, outside courtrooms. She didn't seek recognition. Her name wasn't printed on plaques or awards, but people whispered her name like a prayer, like a legend of someone who once walked the same lonely roads they now feared. And in those whispers, her legacy was born, not in marble or money, but in moments of mercy that rippled further than she would ever know. The judge, now retired, spent his mornings walking through the city not as a man of the law, but as a man finally free of its shadows. He carried a worn notebook where he recorded the names and stories of every life the system had failed, and every time someone found a second chance. He often visited schools, quietly sitting in the back during career days, listening to children speak of justice like it was a seed, not a sword. And when asked who inspired him most, he never mentioned famous lawyers or historic rulings. He simply said, "A woman who once had no roof, but carried more courage than any courtroom I ever stood in." Together, though rarely seen in the same place anymore, they remained tethered by the bond of shared purpose. Occasionally, she would send him a letter, a photo of a life turned around, a baby born in a shelter she helped open, a courtroom ruling that went the right way finally. And in return, he'd send her a folded clipping or a quote he found that reminded him of her fire. Their connection didn't need noise. It needed no audience. It was built in silence, strengthened by truth, and sustained by the promise they both made, to never let another soul go unheard in the shadows. One evening, she sat by the river's edge, watching the lights ripple across the water. A little boy approached her with a sandwich, thinking she was hungry. She smiled, her heart catching. "That's kind of you," she said gently. "But I've eaten today. Keep it for someone who hasn't." He nodded and sat beside her anyway. "My mom said you help people," he whispered. She looked at him, then at the city that once left her behind. "No," she said. "I remind them they're not alone. Sometimes that's all it takes to begin again." The boy didn't understand fully, but years later, he would. And so the story ends not in triumph or tragedy, but in clarity. That no life is too lost to be seen. That the systems we build must hold hands with the hearts we ignore. And that sometimes, the most broken people become the strongest bridges. She was once just a homeless woman. He was once a man too proud to see her. But together, they rewrote what justice could look like. Not perfect, but human. Not loud, but lasting. And in every quiet rescue, every unseen hand reached out in the dark. They lived on, proof that hope is not a myth. It is a decision. One brave soul at a time.